Section 1 of Shadow Forms by Manly P. Hall. This LibriVox recording's in the public domain. Black Hat Sorcery. On the side of a rocky spur stood the rambling monastery. Notwithstanding its prominent position, few travelers had ever seen it or even heard the weird stories circulated by the natives concerning it. While the rocky cliff to which the gray, plastered buildings clung was over 2 miles above sea level, towering mountains on all sides gave to the casual observer the impression that the old lamasery lay in the depths of a valley. Tibet is a great plateau surrounded by the snow-covered Himalayas. It is a land of mystery, one of the last to preserve its primitive customs and to refuse admission to travelers and explorers. Its religion was originally demon worship. With the coming of Buddhism, a day of greater enlightenment dawned for its wild inhabitants. Gradually, however, the demons of primitive days crept into the new theology, until the simple Buddhistic monotheism of India gave place to a complicated religious faith containing more than 80,000 gods. The monastery which we have described was the last to maintain in purity the demonistic faiths of ancient Tibet. It belonged to the peculiar sect known as the Black Hat Lamas. Their abbot lived alone in a great castle-like building, with slanting walls which were pierced by dozens of windows. He was a wise but sinister individual, deeply versed in the magic and sorcery of his cult. The priests dwelt in the less pretentious structures below. They spent their days in prayer and meditation, or in gathering scant revenue for the upkeep of the temple from the native villages on the plains about the lamasery. The most important building in the group on the side of the rocky crag was the great temple to Yama, the lord of the demons, a deity brought from India and blended with the native Tibetan devils. A life-sized wooden statue of this deity stood in an ancient shrine surrounded by statues of lesser divinities. Those who came to worship recognized in this particular idol a great oracle, for they did not know that the voice which spoke to them through its leering mouth was the voice of a priest concealed within the secret compartment in the back of the figure. The temple was reputed by the natives to be of immense wealth. The entire treasure of the Black Hat Lamas was said to have been brought there when the religion vanished from Tibetan life. Gold and jewels beyond conception were rumored to be buried in secret chambers beneath the temple. None save the slant-eyed old abbot knew how to reach these treasures, or what their true magnitude was. In a curio shop in Kyoto, the Japanese antique dealer was explaining to a prospective customer a peculiar skull bowl which he held in his hand. "Yes, most honorable sir," he affirmed. "That is a genuine Tibetan piece, very rare. It is like finding it that you should pay only 250 yen. It is made of one human skull, a very perfect specimen. The native from whom my agent bought it said that it had come from the Black Hat Lamasery, just south of Lhasa." The customer, R.L. Richardson, showed intense interest. Though he had traveled widely, gathering specimens for a large English curio house specializing in Oriental antiquities, this was the first time he had heard of the strange sect. He purchased the skull bowl, and through judicious questioning learned all the dealer could tell him of the primitive religious practices and of the secret temple of the demon worshippers. Richardson was a man of action. He made up his mind immediately to go personally in search of the treasures of the mysterious Black Hat Temple. The Japanese warned him to give up this foolhardy project, but being of an adventurous turn of mind, Richardson set out at once for Darjeeling, where he prepared an expedition and quietly rode into the hills with pack train and 3 or 4 ferocious-looking Tibetan guides, only one of whom spoke English. 5 weeks later, the expedition wound out from among the hills, and just as evening was falling, reached the edge of the plain, near the center of which rose the high ridge surmounted by the gray plastered buildings. "There the place," announced the guide who spoke a little English. "Me never hear of him before myself, but I ask many natives. They tell me here, there, other place, but I figure out. I very bright man. I want extra pay. But master, look out. Black Hat Lama, no like white man. Kill him quick. Eat him up, maybe. Me don't know. You better go home." The adventurer had other plans, however. In halting his pack train, he made camp behind a little spur of hills some 5 miles from the monastery. Commanding his native assistants to remain there until they received orders from him, Richardson started out alone, but armed to the teeth, for the lonely and deserted-looking temple group. It was already dark when he reached the foot of the jagged spur. A few lights glowed from the square windows of the lamasery. Avoiding the beaten path lest he should encounter the priests, Richardson climbed the almost sheer wall. He would never have succeeded but for his South African experiences in the British Army. Reaching the first group of buildings, he carefully skirted the houses of the priests and continued upward toward the great citadel that crowned the promontory. There was no other means of reaching it than the broad flights of stone steps, so keeping as close as he could to the dilapidated plastered walls, he crept upward. A chant was borne to his ears by the evening breezes, and a little later the dull boom of a temple gong sounded. Suddenly a black shadow separated itself from a wall nearby. Richardson quickly drew a revolver and held it in readiness for instant action. The form was that of a priest robed in flowing garments of black and wearing upon his head a broad-brimmed black hat, the crown of which formed a miniature Dagobah-shaped tower. This figure passed like a ghost down the stairs, the flowing robes brushing the point of Richardson's revolver as he crouched behind an angle of the adobe wall. Waiting until he was certain the priest was out of hearing, the Englishman continued his way up the ancient steps, and finally reached the gate of the great octagonal building which housed Yama with his 3 heads. A light was burning in the room of the Lord Abbot, and its rays streaked the courtyard. The temple door was not locked or even closed, and silently as a shadow Richardson passed through the portal and stood in a spacious musty chamber. From the ceilings hung Tibetan temple curtains and pendants, moldy with age, which swayed dismally in a slight draught. The air was heavy with incense, and here and there a red glowing coal showed where great joss sticks and tapers were burning. The floor under his feet was damp and cold. Around him massive pillars rose draped with rotting embroidery. All these things Richardson noted by the aid of a pocket flashlight, which he turned guardedly first in one direction and then another. He realized that he was taking his life in his hands, but the adventurous ex-soldier was happy only when in danger. This evening promised him exceptional happiness. Before him loomed another doorway, smaller than the first, which apparently led to an inner chamber. Picking his way among the boxes of books and temple paraphernalia, Richardson approached the swaying curtain painted with saints and demons that closed the second doorway. Drawing it aside, he peered into the chamber beyond. It was dimly lighted by a single large candle upon a stand in the center of the earthen floor. The walls were hung with paintings of saints. Many lacquered pillars upheld the beamed ceiling. The floor was richly covered with ancient rugs. An enormous incenser stood before him, and opposite, a gilded gate led into a great alcove. Through the carvings of this gate Richardson could faintly discern the jeweled and gold-crested shrine. Never before had he seen so many shadows. The flickering candle flame caused 100 weird reflections. The slowly swinging draperies formed the figures of strange demons on the walls, while the draught blowing through the chambers caused an endless swishing sound. Here and there a tattered ornament flapped dismally. The rafters were grayed with smoke. An oppressive gloom was everywhere. Richardson shivered and, still clenching the revolver, passed swiftly over to the gilded gate. Opening this, he entered the sanctuary. On a lotus dais, surrounded by lesser gods and goddesses, stood the leering Yama. His 3 faces, terrible in expression, glowered at the intruder. The heart of the antiquarian beat for sheer joy. The room was a mass of priceless religious curios, skull bowls with emeralds and rubies inlaid in the rough Tibetan gold, thunderbolts with diamond rays, rosaries of precious stones, enshrined jeweled figures, marvelous tapestries, curious paintings. All these confronted Richardson. He deliberated as to just what he should appropriate. Space was the essence of the contract, and only portable objects could be considered. He studied carefully. The smallest and most precious he would take. A little Buddha cut out of jade with emerald eyes and a magnificent diamond in the forehead met with his approval. Picking up the little figure, he slipped it into his pocket. He then gazed up at the gilded Yama. A splendid necklace of matched pearls which adorned the lacquered throat of the god attracted his professional eye. Casting around for means of reaching the necklace, he discovered a small flight of steps leading up behind the lotus dais. Mounting these steps, he found himself directly behind the many-armed statue of the Lord Demon. Then, for the first time, he noticed that it was hollow. He stepped for a second into the opening in the back of the figure, and found that he could look out with ease through the god's eyeless sockets. The mouth of the god was carved out inside, not unlike a megaphone, but Richardson did not know about the supposed oracular powers of the deity, nor did he realize that the place where he was standing was the place often occupied by the Lord Lama. With his penknife, he lifted 2 small wooden pegs which held the necklace of the god in place, and a moment later the string of pearls reposed next to the Buddha in his jacket pocket. Returning to his position at the front of the sanctuary, Richardson gave one last look around and finally decided to complete his collection by taking the jeweled thunderbolt which rested on the altar. With this in his hip pocket, and a very satisfied feeling in his heart, he decided to depart. 1,000 things he wanted, but he was wise enough to realize that a heavy load might cost him his life. He passed out of the sanctuary through the grated door and stood again in the room of fantastic shadows. The eerie stillness of the place oppressed him. He crept across the floor past the huge candle in its bronze holder, and then, in spite of his constantly growing desire to leave behind that awful place, he paused and gazed round. A faint, nondescript sound reached his ears. His hair stood on end as his eyes noted the swaying shadows which the dim light cast into every corner and recess. Suddenly he realized that the shadows were alive. He laughed under his breath. It must be his imagination. There was no one there. Then he looked again. This time there was no mistaking. Only one thing could cast that kind of a shadow. He could distinguish a broad-brimmed black hat with a strange gilded tassel. It was moving slowly towards him. He looked past the incense burner to the door through which he had just come, and shrank back in terror. Another black hat with its silken tassels was faintly visible, almost as a shadow. Each way he turned he saw these hats. His retreat was cut off. Quickly turning, he bounded to the grated door leading to the inner sanctuary, and passing through, closed it behind him. His previous search had convinced him that there was no way in or out of this room. Standing behind the lattice, he watched the shadows. Suddenly the light glinted on steel. This was no illusion. One of the spectral figures bore in its upraised hand a long, sharp knife. There was a whistling sound. Richardson instinctively ducked his head, which saved his life. A thin steel knife passed through the gratings where his face had been, and, striking a bronze bowl, fell clattering at his feet. Richardson aimed his revolver at first one of the shadows, and then another, but they were so indistinct that he realized it was useless to shoot. Taking his flashlight from his pocket, he pointed it at one of the dark corners. A stream of light cut the darkness and revealed a tall, slender figure, draped from head to foot in sable garments. Over its head the figure wore a grinning papier-mâché mask, of which the broad-brimmed black hat was a part. As the light struck the form, it melted away into the draperies of the wall. At the same instant, a shout arose, and shadowy forms armed with gleaming blades advanced from all directions toward the gilded gate of the shrine. Richardson's revolver spat fire, and groans were added to the shouting. 2 of the figures pitched forward upon the ground. A second later, the room was empty. The black-hatted priests had dissolved. Hour after hour, Richardson watched. Nothing appeared. He dare not leave his retreat. Once he opened the grating a few inches. As he did so, he heard a soft rustling, and focusing his light in the direction whence it came, he observed that the wall curtains were swaying in a manner not caused by the wind. Dawn came. Weary with his vigil, Richardson sat on a small teak stand from which he had removed the incense burner. The sun's rays did not penetrate the gloomy interior of the building. A dim twilight alone showed that it was day without. By its aid, Richardson studied the room and also made a careful investigation of the chamber he himself was in. The adventurer was not a pessimist, but he realized that, in all probability, the present enterprise would be his last. There was no way out save through that hall with its swaying curtains, and he knew that before he could hope to cross it, 20 knives would be buried in his back. The bodies of the 2 llamas were gone. Who had taken them he did not know. Suddenly, as he studied the walls and ceiling through the narrow gratings of the door, he felt the earth moving under his feet. The tightly packed dirt bulged upward slightly. Quickly Richardson jumped back, seeking an escape. There was no place to hide. The inner sanctuary was without adornment other than the great shrine. Then an idea came to him. The best place to take his last stand was within the hollowed-out body of Yama. Quickly, dropping a curtain used for the purpose over the gilded door, so that the llamas without could not see his movements, Richardson climbed the steps which led up to the figure of the god of evil and took up his place of refuge within the hollowed back of the great demon. Through the eye-holes he watched. The earthen floor before the shrine was moving upward. There must be a trap door a few inches under the surface, he concluded, probably leading to the treasure vaults under the temple. Gradually, the floor raised. An opening appeared, revealing a long yellow hand holding up the trap door. A few seconds passed. A black-hatted figure emerged from the opening, and, climbing the steps, stood at the foot of the great statue. After it came another and another, until a dozen or more were gathered there. Richardson kept perfectly silent. The llamas began a search. They opened the grated doors and were joined by several others from the outer room. They talked excitedly, pointing up and down and into various corners, but none of them seemed to suspect the statue of Yama. Then one of them noticed that the god's necklace was gone. He pointed this out to the others. Immediately a howl arose, cries of rage. At the same moment the Lord Abbot arrived, an imposing figure gloriously gowned and wearing a number of rosaries. He muttered a few guttural words, and 4 of the priests, passing around behind the dais, began to climb up towards the great Yama, evidently searching for the necklace. Richardson cursed the hour he stole it, but repentance was of no avail. He turned in the cramped opening, and, as the head of the first priest with its black hat appeared, he fired a bullet between the eyes. A deafening uproar ensued. The priests, carrying the body of their companion, beat a hasty retreat and gathered in a group at the foot of the statue, where they stood nonplussed, gazing up at Yama's gilded form. The abbot pondered for a few moments, and then gave long and detailed instructions. The priests scurried away in several directions. About an hour later, 3 of them returned, 2 carrying a heavy table which they placed at the foot of the shrine. The third was bent under the weight of a long board, on which lay the figure of a human body roughly molded in dough. Footnote: the practice of offering human sacrifice was stopped by the Buddhists, who substituted figures made of bread dough for living victims. End footnote. It was made to represent a white man. This form he laid upon the table. Then all retired again. The day passed. Again the shades of evening enshrouded the temple in impenetrable gloom. A solitary candle brought by a priest shed its flickering light on the figure of dough. Richardson stepped out of the aperture and walked up and down on the dais to stretch his legs. The terrors of another night appalled him. He needed strength for the ordeal. Faint from loss of sleep and lack of food and water, he knew that a day or 2 at most separated him from annihilation. But with that tenacity with which all things cling to life, he resolved to continue his earthly existence as long as possible. His watch said 10 o'clock when again the shadows began to congregate. This time they were more fantastic than before. Out of the gloom trooped a strange pageantry of figures, with the heads of lions, of birds, and of demons. Great dragons came, wild beasts of the jungle, crawling serpents, gigantic birds, bulls with horns 6 or 7 feet long, a motley group swaying, chanting with weird and uncanny rhythm. Suddenly from the midst of the group emerged the abbot, robed in magnificent costume and wearing the domed black hat with its silken tassels. In one hand he carried a thunderbolt, and in the other a long staff ending in a keen, wicked-looking blade. He raised his face towards the great Yama and spoke in broken English. "White man, you come to rob our temple. You steal necklace of Yama. You try find temple treasure. We no hurt you. You rob us. You kill my priests. You must die. I give you choice. Take your devil stick, gun, and kill yourself, or else we shall kill you. You cannot escape. If you shoot a dozen of us, the rest will kill you. If we want, we can starve you to death. You best kill yourself." Richardson laughed mirthlessly. Pointing his revolver through the leering mouth of Yama, he fired at the high priest. The aged man tottered, and the thunderbolt dropped from his hand. The bullet had gone through his shoulder. 2 figures advanced to support him, but with his uninjured hand he waved them back. Coming forward, surrounded by the weird creatures of the temple, the high priest stood before the figure made of dough. An attendant brought him a sharp knife. Raising his eyes towards the face of Yama, the Lama began an ominous chant. Ever higher rose his voice, his words punctuated by the clang of the temple gong and the reverberation of the huge bronze bell. Inhuman howls and cries came from the masked figures about him. Richardson grew dizzy. The walls seemed to sway about him. With an effort he steadied himself, muttering, "This lack of food and sleep is too much for me." At last the chant of the Lama ended in a shrill, wailing cry like the death note of a dying eagle. Silence followed, so dead, so absolute, that it could almost be heard. The aged Lama raised his head and spoke to the hidden white man. You have not killed yourself. Therefore now you die. You die by magic, the magic of the llamas. You cannot fight it, for you do not know the power of black hat sorcery." Leaning over, the old llama with his sharp knife cut through one of the arms of the doe figure. Picking up the dissevered member, he threw it on the ground. From the cleft extremities there poured out red liquid resembling blood. A groan of pain sounded from within the lacquered figure of Yama. The priest then cut off the other arm, then the 2 feet. With a single stroke of the sharp knife, he disemboweled the form. Lastly, he completely severed the head. As he did so, the moans and cries of anguish from within the god ceased, and the hollow wooden form tipped forward from its pedestal. Striking the altarpiece, it turned over and fell with a splintering crash directly in the center of the table. Breaking through this, the great idol fell smashed into a dozen parts to the ground. The old llama stood swaying back and forth, supported by his staff, and gazed down at the form of Richardson. The body was cut and mutilated in the same way as was the figure of Doe.